Alright, so what I'm going to show you today in this particular video has to do with values in JavaScript. Most of this information also applies to most other scripting languages, even though for certain things they may be called slightly differently. And you might be wondering, why am I using a web browser for this purpose? Well, that's because JavaScript is actually a programming language on the client side. On the server side, technically speaking, it is called NodeJS. But they're really the same language. So that means if you want to experiment with values, and along with many other things, it is actually possible to do it within the context of a browser. So that's what we're going to do today. So once you get into a browser, especially something like Firefox, let me turn off the stuff at the... nope, I think I can do a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag my browser down here so that you can see the controls part of it. So right here, you can see open application menu and click on the hamburger. And depending on how much stuff you have, some people have more stuff and some people have fewer stuff. So okay, so once you press that, I can't fit everything into the window because, let me see if I can change the size of my browser, and then we will be able to scroll through the menu accordingly. There we go. Alright, so click on hamburger, and you cannot see the rest of my screen, unfortunately. Alright, so let me try another approach then. Alright, so we'll do it this way. So I'm going to drag it all the way to this side until you can see the hamburger icon, which is this one here. And then you go all the way down to More Tools. So click on More Tools. And now we go to Web Developer Tools. So from now on, we can type Control-Shift-I instead to get into the tools. So I'm going to click that. And then what we'll do is I'm going to resume the original positioning of the browser. So this way we can maximize the amount of area to show the various parts of this particular tool, which is really kind of handy if you're learning how to program in JavaScript. So there's nothing really important where my picture is located now. So let's go ahead and move this part up to maximize the area, because we are not going to be showing anything on the actual browser. We're not rendering anything. Alright, first thing first, let's go ahead and use console.log and see what's going to happen here. Now, with all of these tabs, now this is in Firefox. In Chrome, I think there are things that are very similar. If you don't want to mess around and relearn how to do this in Chrome, you can just go ahead and install Firefox. Okay, I personally really like Firefox. I prefer Firefox to Chrome, mostly for privacy reasons. But other than that, Firefox also works pretty well for most things. There are certain things you can only do in Chrome, so I would not recommend you to uninstall Chrome or Edge if you're using Windows. On the other hand, for development work, for experimenting with stuff, Firefox is actually pretty good. So go to the console tab, make sure the console tab is the one that is active. Now we can start to type something like console.log. So console.log is using the log method of an object that is predefined called console. This is the easiest way for you to type or to look at the result of something. So let's just say that we want to print the value of 5. So you just type, in parentheses, type 5, and obviously it will just give you the output of 5. Now the undefined here with a left arrow, that is indicating the return value of console.log, which is undefined all the time. So don't worry about the undefined with a left arrow next to it, because all that means is console.log as a function. We'll talk about functions in probably the next few lectures, but don't worry about it. It is really just the return value of console.log. It is of no consequence in our examples today. Alright, so if you were to say console.log, and then 5 plus 5, okay? And you wouldn't be surprised if you just print out the value of 10, right? Because 5 plus 5 is indeed 10. So that's what you can do with numbers, okay? Because numbers are used to represent numerical values, and with numerical values, you can perform addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and there's also a math library that will allow you to do sine, cosine, tangent, exponent, and so on and so forth. So JavaScript, has full capability to do, math functions and calculations, just like any other programming language. So I'm going to show you another example where things are not really as straightforward. Okay, so this time I have console.log, and this time I use the double quotes 5 plus double quote 5. So now the question is, what does plus mean in this particular context? Let's press enter first, and then we'll explain the answer. So the answer is 5, okay? I wouldn't call this 55, I'll call it 5. And you can see how the syntax highlighting is different this time. Because when we display a number, it is in green, and this one is in black. It is not in green. Why is that? Well, the reason is when you double quote something, it becomes a string. And with strings, it has very limited operators defined, but the plus operator is used as concatenation. In other words, it is joining two strings to become one longer string. So in this particular example, because I use double quotes to quote the 5 and also the second 5, so each one is basically a string, and in the context of having a plus symbol between two strings, the operator is telling the JavaScript in this case to concatenate the two strings to become a new and longer string in this case. Alright, so we have just covered two very essential but important types in JavaScript. One is a numerical value, and the other one is a string. A numerical value can also be like 5.5, 3.14, and so on. And for those of you who are more inclined to understand the technical stuff, that is because in JavaScript, a number is always a double precision floating point number. So it is a 64-bit representation. It can represent really, really huge values as well as really, really small values. But it does come with a price. The price of using double precision floating point format is beyond a certain point. I believe 2 to the power of 53, it can no longer represent values exactly. So there is a little bit of a caveat of using this type as a default numerical type. Alright, what else can we do with numbers in addition to addition, subtraction, multiplication, and all the math functions that you usually associate with a math class? Well, in programming, one thing that is very important is to make decisions. And in order to make decisions, a lot of times, I wouldn't say all the time, but a lot of times we want to compare numbers. We want to compare numerical values. So now we're going to introduce the comparison operators. So we're going to say, 1 is less than 5. Okay? And obviously, you all know that 1 is indeed less than 5. So what 1 is less than 5 returns as an expression is a special kind of type called a Boolean type, Boolean. And all that means is the answer is always a true or a false. So when I press the enter key, it returns, it prints true on the screen because 1 is less than 5 is true. Now we're going to check out something else. What about 5 is less than 1? Okay, you guys are going to say, no, 5 is not less than 1. Well, technically speaking, it is false. Okay, so the value of 5 is less than 1 is false. Now, true-false value, okay, this is true and this is false. So the true-false values can be used in certain contexts. There are certain operators that are very specific to Boolean values. And those operators are called logical operators. You already know those logical operators just from using English as a natural language. We have already used those. So let's check out some of those. Now we can say, 1 is less than 2 and 2 is less than 3. So the word and is an operator in this case. On the left hand side of the and is a Boolean value. On the right hand side of the and is also a Boolean value. So in this case, we are literally looking at whether 1 is less than 2 and 2 is less than 3. And of course, you're going to say, yeah, sure. I mean, that's really elementary, for anyone who's trying to get into computer science, right? So when I press the enter key, uh-oh, it complains about that because I forgot to close something. Uncaught syntax error, missing close parentheses after argument list. Okay, so what am I missing? Alright, so I'm gonna say true and see if it complains. Nope, it does not like that either. Alright, so I think the problem has to do with the word, the use of the word and. So we're going to replace it with another operator. This one is ampersand, ampersand, and ampersand, two ampersand together. And this time it does work. So I made a mistake because I thought in JavaScript you can actually spell out the word and to mean conjunction, which is a fancy word for and as it turns out, it cannot. So it requires the use of ampersand, ampersand as an operator. So I stand corrected. Alright, so if there's an and, is there a or? Okay, so it turns out there is an or as well. So if with or, it is two vertical bars. And if at least one side of an or is true, then the entire or is true. So when you ask true or false, the answer is going to be true. The only time a OR is going to give you a value of false is when both sides of the OR are false. So if you enter false or false, then the answer is going to be false. With conjunction, with and, the only time you get a result of and is when both sides are true. So if you have at least one side of an and, so console.log. So if at least one side of and is false, then the entire thing is false. So if you ask true and false, then it's going to say false. So those are the logical operators, and there's one more logical operator that is really important. It is negation. It turns whatever is true into false and whatever is false into true. So it really is just the English word not. Except in programming, we don't spell out the word not, just like, hey, right here, we don't spell out the word and. So in programming, in most C-derived programming languages, and that includes PHP as well, negation, not arithmetic, logical negation is an exclamation point. So now you can say console.log and then not true. Okay, the exclamation point means logical negation, and it returns a false. And if you do it the exact opposite way, if you ask for the logical negation of false, then it's going to say it is true. So these are the very basic stuff that you can do, and there are three types introduced at this point. Now, the other nice thing about doing it in this particular fashion is you can actually scroll up and scroll down. Okay, you can actually refer back to earlier examples. We have numerical values where you can perform arithmetic addition, multiplication, division. You can apply all the math functions to numerical values. And then we have strings, okay? And then we talk about the comparison of numerical values. So what we'll do next is we're going to talk about how do you compare strings. Because it is very useful to compare strings, okay? Because we want to see when you are sorting, okay, in any table, most of the time you'll be sorting based on string, which is basically text data. That will be when you need alphabetical order, you need to compare strings. So let's check out whether those operators are also defined for strings. So we'll check out whether ABC is less than DEF, And the answer is true. Okay, that really should not be very surprising because the less than in the context of string comparison is really asking alphabetically or in alphabetical order is the first one preceding the second one. That's what less than is meaning when we're comparing strings. What may be a little bit surprising is when we compare a string of lowercase abc to a string of uppercase abc. The answer is false in this case. And that really has to do with ASCII code encoding. Because the ASCII code of A, which is basically the bit pattern representing lowercase a, is larger than the ASCII code of uppercase A. So this is where you can look up the ASCII table, ASCII ASCII, and then you just type in table, and it will give you the numerical value of each ASCII code corresponding to each character that we can usually use in programming and also in representing data in a database. Okay, so and at this point, I have not performed a comparison that is usually very useful, which is equal to. Okay, that's one thing that we haven't really shown is how do we compare two things to see whether they are the same or not. Well, there's a particular reason why I reserve this one for a little bit later, like right now. Because if I want to compare 5 and see whether 5 equals to 5, most people, especially math professors, would just say, this is the way to do it. Okay, we want to compare a value 5 to a value 5. Now, I know this is not a very challenging expression to evaluate, but the point is not about whether 5 does equal to 5 or not. The question is, what is the operator to compare two values? Because a single equal symbol has a different meaning in most programming languages than what mathematicians would think it means. So when I press the enter key, it goes like, invalid left-hand value. What is going on here? So as it turns out, the single equal symbol means assignment. Okay, what is assignment? Assignment can be seen as copy. Okay, if you want to make the best explanation out of the assignment operator, it is quote unquote copy the right hand side to the left hand side. So in this case, I'm trying to copy a constant of 5 to a constant of 5, which doesn't work because it requires something that can change on the left-hand side. So this doesn't work. But more importantly, let's get back to how we got here, right? We want to find out how to compare two different values. So if it's not a single equal, what is that going to be? Well, I think what we have seen earlier is going to give you a clue. So single ampersand does not mean logical and. Single bar does not mean or. You need double ampersand and double vertical bar to mean those the logical operators. So in this case, we just have to double up the single equal symbol so that we have double equal as an operator. So now we have console log 5 equal 5. Okay, so that is going to work because now it becomes a comparison operator instead of an assignment operator. Now we can compare numerical values. Can we compare strings? So let's check out, okay, does ABC equal to uppercase ABC? The answer is no, false, okay, because because in comparison of strings in JavaScript and most programming languages, not all, it is case sensitive. So that's why lowercase abc is not the same as uppercase abc. Alright, so let's check out console.log. And this time we compare lowercase abc to just lowercase abc. Not surprisingly, those are considered the same. It's true. Okay. So what about less than or equal to? How do we spell out less than or equal to? So I'm going to use the up arrow key to repeat the previous example. All you have to do is to specify this. This means less than or equal to, but you cannot change the ordering of the less than and the single equal symbol because this together is the less than or equal to symbol. So in this case, ABC is less than or equal to ABC. It's true because they are indeed the same. All right. Let me take a look at the time. All right. So now we're going to talk about something that is a little bit more interesting, which are composite types. So what we have touched on right now are simple types. Okay, there you can also call those atomic. Okay, which means they cannot be broken down into smaller components, which is not entirely true, especially for strings. But for the time being, we'll just call these atomic types, which means they are it's each constant specifies a thing, and we cannot break it apart. So the next two types that we are going to talk about are composite. So composite types would include two um, specific ways of combining things in JavaScript. One is called an array, and then the second one is called an object. We'll talk about an array first. Okay. So in the case of an array, you can specify an array as a constant by using open square bracket, and then you specify whatever value you want to put into the array, and whatever you put into the array can be any value. So you can have a numerical value followed by a string, followed by another numerical value, and then followed by yet another string, something like that. That is actually perfectly okay. So this is what we call a literal array, which means it is an array, it is spelled out, and console.log doesn't have a problem showing you that this is an array of 4 items, and the 4 items are 4 as a numerical value, ABC as a string, -1 as a numerical value, and DEF as a string. Now, this is where I kind of have to warn people who want to get into programming in JavaScript, and not JavaScript, in Java, C, or C++, because this you cannot do in those languages, okay, for a few reasons. But I'm just giving you a warning right now. Okay, and you can see a little symbol here. That means you can expand it. So if you click on the expansion, all it does is to give you a more detailed view of the array. And now you can see there's a 0, 1, 2, 3 next to the values. What are those? Those are called indexes of each item in an array. In other words, it will help you identify which item, if you need to identify one particular item in an array, that number to the left hand side is called the index. It allows you to specify one item out of an array of multiple items. So let's check that out. Okay, how does that work? So now we use the up arrow key, get back to here, but this time after the first close square bracket, I'm going to use a second square bracket to enclose what we call the index. So I'm going to specify index of 1. So the index of 1, specifies the second item. Now I know this is counterintuitive to most people, because in programming, doesn't matter which programming language you're using, except for, I think, COBOL and certain variants of BASIC. But for almost every single programming language, Python, Java, C, C++, PHP, and so on, they start counting from 0. So the index of 0 would refer to the first item, and that's why the index of 1 is referring to the second item. So when I press the enter key, it says, hey, it's ABC, which is correct, right? And you can now also say, what about the item with index 3? The item with index 3 is actually the 4th item, which is DEF, and that's also the last item of the array, and it will print DEF. And someone adventurous is going to say, what about if I say indexing 4, because it doesn't even exist, right? What is going to happen here? And it comes back as an answer as undefined, which is the appropriate answer, because there really is not an item at index 4, which is actually our 5th item, because the entire array only has, guess what, 4 items. Alright, so besides indexing, what else can you do with an array? Well, you can check out its length. So if you do a dot length, now remember the dot means apostrophe s, okay? So in this case, we are asking, what is the length of this literal array of 4 ABC -1 DEF? And the answer is quite simple. It is 4. There are 4 items in this particular array. So I'm going to take a pause here to kind of tell you guys why arrays are important. The most important aspect, there are two important aspects to an array. One is it is a composite type, which means it can be used to contain a collection of items. And number two, okay, the second really important point of an array is we get to each item in the array using a index, which is basically just an integer, a natural number, because it cannot go negative. And that allows us to set up loops later on so that we can go through items in an array using a loop, and all the loop needs to do is to increment the index. Then we can go from the first item to the second item, from the second item to the third item, and so on. Okay, so this is the convenience that array is affording us, which is basically it's very easy to get to each item, and we get to each item using a natural number. And once we learn how to use a loop to iterate through a range of natural numbers, then we have a way to go through every single item in an array in a specific order. So ordering is important in an array. Being able to store multiple items is also important in an array. All right, so remember I said there's one more thing. When after we talked about Boolean, numerical values, and strings, I said there are two more things that we need to learn about values in JavaScript and Node.js. And the last one is called an object. So an object is basically also a container. It allows you to contain multiple things within one thing. So you can look at this as a folder. Okay, it's kind of like a folder in a file system. You can contain multiple files into a folder, but you can also include folders in a folder too. So it can nest. Arrays can nest too, but this one is a little bit more interesting because the way you create an object is to use the curly braces. The curly braces, or just braces, it's kind of like the purpose of the square bracket. It gives you a chance to create an object on the fly. And when you want to create an object and you want to specify things inside an object, they are identified by names. Okay, so in this case, I might say first name colon is the string tag, and then we use a comma to separate all the different items. In this case, just like we use comma to separate items in an array. So we use a comma to separate, and then we say last name is Anyang. And note that we are not using an equal symbol here. We're using a colon, and you can even say role. Oops, we don't need quotes here. So we can now say role is professor, like that. Okay. Now I have just created a very simple object. It has three what we call members. So this object that we are creating on the fly, how do we know this is an object? The curly braces. Okay, there's one curly brace all the way here, and there's one of the closed curly braces all the way back here. That is how we know we are creating an object. So within the object, we have three members. Okay, so each item within an object is called a member. The first member of this particular object is identified by the name first name, and it currently has a value of tag. The second member of this particular object has a name of last name. This is how we identify that particular object. And for that particular member, it has a value of Anyang, which is my last name. And we have a third member of this particular object. It has the name of role, and the value of this particular member is professor. So remember two things. One is there's a name to each member so that we can differentiate a member from all of the other members within an object, and then each member also has a value. Okay, so this is the value of a particular member, and you can print out an object just like that. Okay, so console.log does not have a problem printing out the content of an object, and as the previous example, when you see this little symbol here, we can click on it and it will just display in a little bit more it can be more verbose once we expand it. So it's easy to view in this case. So I know some of you are asking, then how do we get to a particular member in an object? Well, that's a very interesting question because there are several ways to do it. The first way to do it is to use the dot notation. Remember, the dot means apostrophe s. In other words, the dot allows you to specify a particular member of an object. So console.log really is referring to the member called log, L-O-G, of the object called console. So console itself is an object with a member called log. Now you might say, but log seems like a function. Can we really have a function as a member? The answer is yes. It is called a method, but we'll get to that later on. Okay, that's a fairly advanced topic, so we are not too concerned about it. Right now, we are much more concerned about how do we get back to the first name of this object? All you have to do is to spell out the name of the member within the object, and it will get to the value and print it out. Okay. So similarly, we can get to the other two members by the name. One is role, that's our last one, and then the other one is our last name, like so. Oh, that's kind of cool, right? So what if you try to access a member that does not exist? Let's check it out, right? Okay, so we'll access a member called gender, which is not a part of the object, and it returns undefined. Just like when you access an array out of the index range, out of the length of the array, it gives you undefined. When you try to access a member within an object that doesn't exist, it also gives you undefined. So you can check for undefined. Now you might look at this undefined here and think that it is just printing it as undefined, but there's really no way to use the value called undefined. That is actually not true, okay? Because now let me show you what you can do with undefined. It is a very useful constant that you can use in your programming. The first thing we do is we just say, console.log undefined. And it just prints it without any problem, right? Because it is not a syntax error, which means the word undefined is in fact defined. It has a meaning in JavaScript. Not only that, you can also see whether a value is undefined or not. The simplest thing you can do is to check to see whether undefined is the same thing as undefined. And the answer is true. Not very surprising, right? So what we can also do now is to try to access a certain... Oh, okay, let me use the up arrow key to go back to here. Okay, so going back to the gender example here, we know the gender does not exist. So now we want to see if the value of the member gender of this particular object equals to undefined or not. And the answer is true. So later on, when we get into conditional statements and loops and stuff like that, this becomes very handy because it allows us to process things in two different routes, depending on whether a member does exist in an object or not. And later on, we'll also see how we can look at the data in a form, in an HTML form that is being sent back to the server as an object. So all this stuff is going to come back because they are actually extremely handy. There's one more thing, okay? I know this lecture is a little bit longer, okay, but I think it is important to point this out as well. There's a different way to refer to an item in an object. So spelling it out, okay, in this case is one way to do it. Spelling out gender using the dot notation is one way to do it. But sometimes you might want to check out whether a member exists or not, and the generation of the name of the member may be based on a program. It's programmatic. So that means you cannot just use a dot notation and then followed by whatever whatever name of a member that you want to check, okay? Because it's going to be something that varies over time. So what you can do is to use, this is going to look kind of confusing. is you use the square bracket notation. So it is borrowing the square bracket notation, which is indexing from arrays. But in this case, instead of using an integer or a natural number between the square brackets to identify which thing you want to access in the case of an array, now you can specify a string. So we specify the string gender, and close the console log, and this one returns undefined because, as it turns out, there are two ways to specify exactly the same thing. The dot notation does not require, I shouldn't say does not require, it does not make use of the double quote. Okay, so you just say a dot notation and then a name, immediately the name of the member that you want to access in an object. When you use the square bracket notation, then you need to use a string in between, and therefore the double quotes are necessary. So, but there are two ways to do it. The first way, using the dot notation, is kind of the shorthand way of doing things, and then the second way of using the square bracket to access a particular member in an object is not so handy to type. Okay, it does involve typing a little bit more, but at the same time, it is also a more flexible way for us to try to get to certain things or certain members in a particular object. Okay, so before I terminate this particular lecture, let's make sure that we can indeed get back to something that does exist, right? Because it is entirely possible that I got something wrong, and therefore it returns undefined. So let's go ahead and access something that is defined, like role. So ROLE, make sure it is in double quotes, right? Press Enter key, and it prints the value of professor. So it does work out, right? So this is really cool. So let me summarize what this video has demonstrated. One, how to use your browser. In this case, Firefox. Chrome has a very similar feature. You can probably just Google. If you just Google Chrome developer and JavaScript console, just look for those four words. I think the first or the second link is going to show you how to do exactly the same thing in Chrome. Okay, so that's the first thing, how to get into this environment so that we can play around. Second thing, okay, this is also why being able to scroll back and forth is useful. So we introduce three basic types, or atomic types. The first one is a numerical value, which you can use for arithmetic addition, multiplication, subtraction, and division. But later on, we also see that we can do comparison with numerical values. Okay. Second one will be strings. Okay, strings must be enclosed in double quotes, at least for the time being. There are other ways to enclose a string, but we'll talk about that later on. And strings can also be compared using less than or equal to. And there's a third type, which is Boolean, true versus false. And that is the return value of all the comparisons. Every time you compare something, it will return true or false. And the values for true or false can be operated on using conjunction, which is ampersand, ampersand, or, which is double vertical bar, and also not, which is an exclamation point here. And then we also talk about the comparison of strings. Okay, it's based on ASCII code. So the ASCII code of lowercase a is actually larger than the ASCII code of uppercase a, and that's why when we check whether ABC lowercase is less than ABC uppercase, the answer is false. To check for equality, you use double equal because single equal has a different meaning. It means assignment. So you have to use double equal when you want to compare whether two things are the same or not. And then we got into arrays. Okay. And with arrays, it's basically a collection of items where ordering is important, and every item in the array is called an element, is identified by its index, which is basically just a natural number starting with 0 all the way up to the length of the array minus 1, because we start counting from 0. To get to a specific item in an array, we use square bracket notation, which is basically technically indexing into the array. So this part here is what we call indexing. And if you try to index into an element that does not exist, then it will give you undefined. And then we start to talk about objects. Okay, so the main difference between an object and an array is how we get to items inside the composite thing. With an array, we use the index, which is a natural number. With an object, we use the name of the member to identify which member we want to access. There are two ways to access a specific member in an object. The dot notation is usually used because it is very simple and it is very easy to read. But occasionally, if you want to use a program to generate the name of a member and then check whether that member is a part of an object or not, then you can also use the square bracket notation, except in this case, you're not using a natural number between the square brackets, you're using a string between the square brackets to identify the name of the member that you are attempting to access. If the member doesn't exist, it is undefined. It will return a value of undefined, which you can then compare to the constant that is also called undefined, and this is how you can check whether a particular member exists in an object or not. So I think that pretty much sums up, all the different types of values we can specify in JavaScript and Node.js. The next class, the next lecture, is going to be about variables. In other words, it is kind of repetitive, to have to mention the same object over and over again. Isn't there a way to store the object into something so that we don't have to redefine the literal object in all of these examples? So the answer is yes. Okay, we'll get to that in the next video. Alright, so if you got any questions, don't forget, you can contact me. You can contact me using Canvas, using the messaging capability of Canvas. But you can I encourage people to go to the Discord server for this class because Discord is very convenient for this purpose. You can include screenshots, which in this case is going to be very handy, right? Because if you try to do something, you don't quite understand why the result is the way it is. You can just take a screenshot, paste it into Discord, and then I can look at your screen, and that makes it very easy for me to diagnose the problems and also to explain things because I can show my screenshots as well very conveniently in Discord. So I highly encourage everybody to join the Discord server for this class, and the way to join it is already in the announcements. So go back to the announcements to check it out. Alright, so we got about 40 minutes-ish, kind of into this particular lecture. I hope this is useful, and you might want to keep your own index of the videos. In other words, use a spreadsheet, okay? I don't really care whether you use Excel, whether you use Google Sheet or what, okay? You make your own table of contents, okay? This is, this video, put a link over there, is about the use of values and types in Node.js. Okay, just brief description and a link to the video. So that way, if you ever need to refer back to an earlier video, you have your index. You have your own table of contents. This stuff will sit on the YouTube channel, basically for all eternity. It's going to be there. The question is, can you find it? Okay, so I would ask you to put in a little bit of effort to do the indexing, to borrow the terms in today's lecture, to index everything. Because in the process of doing this, you are exercising your mind, is actually doing things, and it helps you absorb the material just by doing that, just by creating that spreadsheet and creating an entry to map the lecture content as a description to the link to the video. Alright, so I'm going to leave that up to you to do, and I'm going to close the recording session, and then I'll upload it to YouTube.